Hello, my name is Hugo Chiasson. I'm a current junior at Geffen Academy at UCLA, and I'm here to introduce my research on the introduction of bills into the 111th through 116th Congresses, which is the time period of 2009 through 2021, by co-sponsorship, by political affiliation, and by policy area. My focus was on introduction rather than outcome, which is a shift away from the general research in the political science field of legislative study and outcomes of legislation, because I feel that introduction is a better sense of the ideal or the possibilities for legislation and the legislative process compared to outcome, which is just what's happened. Now, I'm analyzing bills and joint resolutions, which are two of the three kinds of types of legislation which can be introduced into Congress in either house, because bills and joint resolutions, I feel, are better respective or reflective of what actual legislation is compared to concurrent resolutions, which are generally budgetary measures. Now, policy area is a designation provided by the Congress to every bill, irrespective of who introduced it, what chamber it's coming from, if it came from a committee, et cetera, et cetera. And there are 33 unique policy areas which can be given as designations to any given bill. We'll touch on a couple of those later. Co-sponsorship is a system of support whereby other members of Congress can sign on in support of any given bill to, well, show their support. It's not limited by party affiliation, and it happens at many stages various stages rather, during the legislative introduction process. And it can be viewed as a metric for bipartisanship, and we will be viewing it as such moving forward. I was able to download information on every single bill and joint resolution introduced into the 111th through 116th Congresses by scraping the congress.gov API using a Python 3 program, which I wrote. And then I was able to then aggregate that data and sort through that data using another Python 3 program. So on to the data. Here are 6 policy areas tracked across the time period studied. I chose these because I think that they tell either an interesting story with a historical reasoning behind them, which we'll touch on later, or because they showcase something interesting about either the legislative process itself or the specific policy focuses that were going on across the time period studied. Now, this is just counts. This says nothing about the individual impact of any given bill, nor does it say anything about co-sponsorship. I'm viewing policy area and co-sponsorship as disparate areas in terms of this analysis, not only for simplicity's sake, but also for the purpose of data aggregation and the amount of time it would take to code these individually by hand. So we can see that there are some interesting trends. Straight off the bat, foreign trade and international finance stands out for the significant spike in the 112th Congress, followed by a significant decline in the 113th Congress, and then a relatively stable count of bills introduced following in the time period studied. Compare that, in a sense, with health, which is continually increased over the time period studied, or government operations and politics, which remained relatively stable until the 114th Congress, at which point following it started to increase the count of bills introduced. We'll touch on some of the historical reasonings, as I said, later. On to co-sponsorship. I was able to aggregate data on co-sponsorship in a bipartisan manner, which is a metric I determined by saying that a given bill which is co-sponsored in a bipartisan manner has at least one co-sponsor from both sides of the aisle. Because there are more than just Democrats and Republicans in Congress, there are independents and libertarians. I established 2 caucuses reflective of the 2 essential caucuses that we have in Congress today. Now, if we look at counts, we can see that the actual count is increasing over the time period studied. That's not to say anything of past Congresses or even historical data, and we'll touch on that fact later. But this is reflective of counts. It's not reflective of rates, because there is a disparity in the number of bills introduced into any given Congress. For example, the 111th Congress had 10,769 bills that I was able to analyze, compared to the 116th Congress, which had 14,333 bills that I was able to analyze. So we have to view them in terms of percentages or in terms of rates. So when we do look at that in terms of rates, when we do look at co-sponsorship or bills co-sponsored in a bipartisan manner in terms of rates, we're able to see that the rate of bipartisanship, in a sense, is relatively stable in terms of introduction, hovering at around 30 to 35%, with an outlier in the 112th Congress on that front. And we'll touch on what that means now, actually. So for a policy area, there are certain historical explanations to, again, certain trends. For example, foreign trade and international finances spike and then subsequent decline can easily be linked to the 2008 recession and the government push to bounce back economically from that. And then health, its increase specifically in the 116th Congress can be related to the COVID-19 pandemic. We can also see a disparity between presented policy focus, at least in terms of how news media presents policy focus, and what are hot button issues and actual focus. For example, if we think back to immigration, immigration has been a hot button issue, especially over the past 8 or 6 or so years, and we can see that even though it has been a hot button issue, it never reached more than 500 bills introduced in the time period studied. And again, in the 116th Congress, where it reached its zenith in terms of the time period studied, there were 14,000 some odd bills introduced into that Congress. So as a percentage of overall bills introduced, and we view it in terms of legislative focus, it's actually relatively minor. Again, that's to say nothing about impact or importance of any individual piece of legislation or time spent on it. That is merely counts, and that is merely counts in terms of introduction. Again, we can see, as discussed earlier, that the counts of bills co-sponsored in a bipartisan manner is increasing, whereas the rates are relatively stable. Now, we can contrast that with the discussion in the news of bipartisanship, where we hear rhetoric that bipartisanship is dying and that cooperation between the aisles or across the aisles is a long gone pastime, or that we have lost bipartisanship or bipartisan support for legislation. And we often view that in terms of voting along party lines. But when we look at introduction and when we look at co-sponsorship, which again, as I mentioned earlier, can be viewed as a metric for bipartisanship, we can see that bipartisanship in terms of the rates of bipartisanship has actually been relatively stable, even though the discussions of bipartisanship have actually showed or said the opposite. Even there's a slight increase because the 111th Congress had a slightly lower rate of bipartisanship than the 116th Congress, or even the 115th. Now, the question is, what other research needs to be done? What other study needs to happen in this field in order to understand it better? And that means more historical data and more granularity in the analysis, as well as the contextual aspects of analysis. As for more historical data, being able to view the historical trends in co-sponsorship and policy area in terms of introduction would allow us to understand whether or not the trends that we see in terms of what actually gets the most focus has shifted over time, or they've remained relatively stable, as reflected in historical data, as well as co-sponsorship rates and, of course, introduction rates and the number of bills introduced into any given Congress, or the overall over time. And then in terms of granularity and contextual aspects of analysis, being able to understand the individual impact of a bill or the time spent on a bill, focusing on individual pieces of legislation or introduced legislation would allow for more understanding and more nuance in the analysis compared to just looking at counts. And then being able to examine those big bills and also examine policy focus as coded by hand, because the 33 policy areas are not all encompassing, and oftentimes bills have more than one policy focus. Looking at the actual impact or the actual focus of a bill would allow for more specificity and more understanding of what is actually being focused on in Congress. I would like to thank Dr. Ashforth, the Director of Student Research Programs at Geffen Academy, and Ms. Sontag as well. They were both integral mentors in terms of me understanding where to take this project and this research, and I'm so grateful for them and their help throughout this work. Dr. Spell, the iTrack Department Chair as well, for helping me understand how to collect the data, as well as how to aggregate it and understand it, and Ty Brennan and Joel Osher for their help with the various technical aspects of the coding of this process and this project. If you have any questions, my email is on the screen. Please do reach out to me as such. Thank you so much for listening to my work. I hope you enjoy the rest of Research Week.